The stone bit into Sloane's bare knees, colder than the wind whipping through the stronghold courtyard. She kept her head bowed. The freezing concrete of the execution block scraped against her bruised collarbone. Her fingers, numb and pale, crushed the last dry flakes of mountain ash against her palm. She slipped the toxic dust under her tongue. It burned right away, a sharp chemical fire sliding down her throat. Her heart stuttered before settling into a sluggish rhythm. The poison flooded her veins, freezing her blood and masking her natural scent. To the obsidian wolves pacing the perimeter, she smelled like wet slate and dead earth. He smelled like nothing. Sloane squeezed her eyes shut. She was a healer. She knew exactly what the ash was doing to her liver, her nervous system, and her mind. It was a slow destruction of her own body just to stay invisible. But invisibility hadn't saved her packmates years ago. She had hidden in the dark while the Obsidian regime tore them apart, rationalizing her cowardice as survival. And now the survival was over anyway. A heavy steel-toed boot crunched into the snow beside her. The executioner. He smelled of stale sweat, cheap whiskey, and old copper. Sloane focused on the freezing air tearing into her lungs, tracking the numbness creeping up her spine. If she could just stay numb enough, maybe the blade wouldn't hurt. Quiet little mouse, the executioner sneered, his gravelly voice barely cutting through the storm. Not going to beg? Sloane tasted blood where she had bitten the inside of her cheek. Begging wouldn't save her. It never saved anyone under this regime. She was just the unrecognized healer, a ghost kept around to stitch up bar brawls, and now, a convenient sacrifice to appease a neighboring threat. The wind screamed across the brutalist concrete walls, drowning out the sound of the pack gathering in the courtyard. Hundreds of boots shuffling in the snow. Hundreds of lungs breathing out white mist. The cold was a physical weight on her shoulders. She deserved this. The thought whispered through her poisoned mind. She had let herself become nothing, and now she was dying for nothing. Then a deep rhythmic vibration hummed through the granite beneath her knees. It wasn't the wind. It was a structural pressure. She felt it in her bones before she heard it. The executioner chuckled, a wet, ugly sound. He dragged his heavy steel blade across the stone block, the high-pitched scrape setting her teeth on edge. He raised his arms, the leather of his jacket groaning under the strain. Sloane braced for the impact, welcoming the dark. But the impact didn't come from above. The ground beneath her shuddered, shaking the executioner off balance. Heavy footsteps crunched on the raised platform. The air pressure shifted as a dense wave of dominance rolled over the freezing courtyard. The Obsidian Alpha. Sloane's stomach twisted into a hard knot of nausea. She stared at the snow clinging to his polished leather boots. If she looked at his face, he won. Brothers and sisters of the Obsidian Pack. The Alpha's voice boomed, echoing off the high concrete walls. It was smooth, practiced, and hollow. Today we make a necessary trade. A small price to secure our borders against the filth that encroaches on our territory. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the gathered wolves. Sloane's fingernails bit so deeply into her frozen palms that the skin broke. A small price. That was all her life amounted to. This girl. The Alpha paced a slow theatrical circle around her, his voice dropping into a mock-sympathetic croon. She has served no purpose. He is weak. Unclaimed. A ghost eating our rations. By offering her blood, we buy our pack 50 years of undisturbed peace. The humiliation burned hotter than the wind. It settled in her chest, suffocating and sharp. Sloane forced her focus inward, chasing the burning sensation of the mountain ash traveling through her bloodstream, concentrating on the icy numbness spreading through her fingers and toes. Don't listen to him. Don't let him see you break. She doesn't even have the courage to face her Alpha, he taunted, stopping in front of her. He kicked a spray of dirty snow into her face. Look at me, little ghost. Sloane didn't move a muscle. Her jaw clamped shut. The toxic ash made her vision swim, blurring the harsh edges of the courtyard, but her mind remained furiously clear. He hated him. He hated the pack that stood by and watched. But most of all, she hated herself for kneeling here and letting it happen. Fine, the Alpha spat, his performative warmth vanishing into bored annoyance. Get it over with. The executioner adjusted his grip on the steel. The thick leather of his gloves creaked loudly. Sloane took one final jagged breath, letting the icy air fill her poisoned lungs, and closed her eyes. The silence stretched thin like a wire about to snap. Then a deafening crack shattered the air. The sound physically knocked the breath out of her lungs. It wasn't thunder. It was the horrific sound of reinforced steel and solid wood being ripped apart from the hinges. The stronghold gates had just exploded inward. Sloane's eyes snapped open. The execution block vibrated against her chest. Through the swirling snow, the iron gates of the stronghold were gone, twisted and thrown across the courtyard like discarded trash. Where they had stood, a living nightmare bled into the compound. Shadows. Fast, fluid and silent. Sloane watched in paralyzed shock as the first wave of invaders crashed into the obsidian perimeter. There were no battle cries, only the wet, sickening sound of tearing flesh and snapping bone. The shadow pack had breached the walls. The obsidian wolves, caught off guard, scrambled to shift. They never made it. Sloane watched a pitch-black wolf launch itself through the blizzard, its jaws locking onto an obsidian guard's throat with mechanical precision. The white snow turned red. Panic erupted. The Alpha's grandiose confidence vanished, replaced by frantic orders that were instantly drowned out by the slaughter. Her body moved on instinct. Sloane shrank back against the execution block, trying to press herself into the cold stone, trying to be as small as possible. The toxic ash pulsed heavily in her veins, masking her scent. The executioner, forgetting about her, raised his blade and turned toward the chaos. He didn't take a single step. A blur of darkness slammed into him from the side. Sloane flinched away, throwing her arms over her head as a spray of hot blood hit the back of her neck. When she opened her eyes a fraction of a second later, the executioner was gone, leaving only a steaming stain in the snow beside her block. She couldn't breathe. The air in the courtyard had fundamentally changed. It was too thick, pressing down on her lungs with the weight of a collapsing building. Through the haze of violence, a single figure walked through the shattered gates. He didn't run. He didn't shift. He walked into the slaughter with an unhurried, terrifying calm. He wore a dark coat, shadows clinging to his broad shoulders, absorbing the pale light of the storm. Vane. The shadow pack leader. The moment he stepped into the center of the courtyard, the violence halted. It didn't taper off, it stopped dead. A suffocating wave of dominance rolled off his skin. It was a physical pressure. All around the courtyard, the surviving obsidian wolves were slammed into the snow. They dropped to their hands and knees, gagging, unable to stand against the sheer weight of his aura. Even the obsidian alpha fell hard, his face pressed into the freezing dirt, trembling. But Sloane felt nothing. The toxic mountain ash isolating her nervous system acted as a deadening shield. While every other werewolf in the stronghold was flattened by the Shadow Alpha's power, Sloane remained kneeling upright by the block. She was the only thing in the entire courtyard not pressed into the dirt. As the quiet settled over the blood-soaked snow, Vane stopped walking. He turned his head slowly, his eyes cutting through the raging blizzard, and locked his gaze on her. The blizzard howled, but Sloane heard nothing but the crunch of his boots in the snow. Vane was moving toward her. He navigated the sea of flattened obsidian wolves with devastating indifference. Around him, the surviving guards were shaking uncontrollably, practically weeping under the weight of his dominance. Vane didn't even look at them. He took up the entire courtyard simply by existing. Sloane's chest tightened, a cold spike of panic piercing the sluggish haze of her mind. Her toxic ash, the very thing she had swallowed to erase her existence, had done the exact opposite. It shielded her from his aura. It kept her upright. In a courtyard of broken, groveling bodies, she was a glaring anomaly. "My lord, please." The pathetic, wet sound came from the obsidian alpha. He was struggling on his hands and knees a few feet away, his pristine coat stained with mud and his own people's blood. He was visibly straining against the invisible pressure, trying to project the image of a leader while eating dirt. Vane didn't break his stride. He walked straight past the groveling alpha, treating him like a piece of broken furniture. Sloane's breath hitched. She watched the physical contrast. Her old tormentor was sweating, trembling, begging to be acknowledged. The shadow leader was cool, cloaked in rain and shadow, untethered to the desperation of the room. Her instinct screamed at her to throw herself to the ground. She needed to mimic the others to hide. But her muscles were locked tight, frozen stiff by terror and the heavy dose of mountain ash paralyzing her nervous system. She was trapped in her own upright body. Vane stepped onto the execution platform. The wood groaned under his weight. He towered over her, blocking out the pale, stormy light. Up close, the smell of him was overwhelming, sharp ozone, crushed pine and fresh bloodshed. Sloane stared straight ahead at the silver buckles of his coat. She refused to look higher. If she stayed perfectly still, maybe he would realize she was nothing. But the silence stretched and he didn't move away. The noise of the courtyard dropped away. The howling wind, the whimpering of the obsidian wolves, the shifting of the shadow pack. It all faded into a dull, distant hum. All Sloane could hear was the frantic stutter of her own heart. Thump, pause, thump thump. Vane crouched down. He moved with a smooth, predatory grace that made the hairs on Sloane's arms stand up. Suddenly, his face was level with hers. She couldn't stop herself. Her eyes flicked up, meeting his. His eyes were black, the pupils blown wide and feral. The shadow wolf just beneath his skin was raging, desperate for violence. He leaned in close. So close the heat radiating off his skin combated the freezing wind. He was breathing her in. Sloane squeezed her hands into fists, fighting the urge to flinch. He wouldn't smell fear. He wouldn't smell prey. The ash guaranteed she smelled like cold stone. But Vane wasn't smelling her. She watched his dark eyes dilate further. His head tilted a fraction of an inch, aligning his ear with the hollow of her throat. He wasn't tracking her scent. He was listening to the erratic chemical frequency of her heart rate fighting against the poison. His wolf recognized the toxic rhythm. It recognized the impossible stillness. Slowly, deliberately, Vane reached out. He lightly pressed 2 fingers under her jaw, his thumb resting against her icy cheek. His skin was burning hot against her freezing flesh. Thump, thump, thump. Sloane forgot how to breathe. The magnetic pull of his touch was terrifying. She was staring into the face of a feral god who had just slaughtered half her pack. And yet, the moment his skin met hers, a strange, desperate quiet settled over her panic. For the first time in her life, Sloane felt seen. Her invisibility shield was shattered. "You..." The Obsidian Alpha choked out from the mud behind them, his voice raw. "She is a sacrifice. She is Obsidian property." Vane didn't look back. He kept his eyes locked on Sloane. 1 second passed. 2 seconds. The slight delay in acknowledging the local alpha was louder than a scream. It was the ultimate display of who actually owned the courtyard. No, Vane's voice was a low rumble that vibrated through Sloane's chest. He finally stood up. "The sacrifice is cancelled. This one belongs to me." The words hung in the freezing air, absolute and unquestionable. Sloane stared at Vane's broad back, her mind spinning. Belongs to him. A disorienting rush of adrenaline flooded her poisoned veins. It was a cocktail of pure terror and dark vindication. The alpha who had humiliated her and offered her up as a cheap trade was currently eating snow. And the lethal invader who had broken their gates had bypassed the golden royalty of the pack just to claim the broken healer. "Secure the courtyard." Vane's voice cut through the storm, flat and authoritative. "Disarm the survivors. Anyone who shifts, dies." Shadow wolves materialized from the blizzard. They hauled the trembling obsidian guards to their feet, stripping them of their weapons. The stronghold was taken. The dynamic of power had flipped in less than 3 minutes. "Take the old alpha to the holding cells in the catacombs," Vane commanded, not even looking as his men dragged the sputtering obsidian leader away by his coat collar. Then Vane turned his head slightly, his gaze landing on 2 shadow guards standing near the execution block. "Take her to the alpha's quarters," Vane said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a tight tension. "Lock the doors. Let no one else inside." Sloane's vindication evaporated, replaced by cold dread. Her body moved on instinct as the 2 guards stepped onto the platform, gesturing for her to walk. Her legs were stiff, the toxic ash making her movements jerky, but she forced herself to stand. She didn't look at Vane as she passed him. She was guided through the blood-stained courtyard and pushed into the main keep. The stronghold was chaotic, filled with the harsh shouts of the invaders claiming territory, but Sloane was marched straight up the main stone staircase. They reached the heavy reinforced oak doors of the Alpha's private quarters, a room she had never been allowed to approach, let alone enter. The guards shoved the doors open. Sloane stumbled inside, her bare feet hitting the luxurious rugs. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind her. The sound of the iron deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the empty room like a gunshot. She was trapped. Alone. Waiting for a feral king. The deadbolt slid back with a harsh metallic grind. Sloane scrambled backward until her spine hit the mahogany bookcase. She pressed herself flat against the wood, her feet sinking into the carpet. The heavy oak door swung open and Vane stumbled inside. He slammed the door shut, leaning his full weight against the wood. The terrifying, unhurried composure he had weaponized in the courtyard was gone. He was suffocating. Thick, black mist bled from the pores of his skin. It rolled off his shoulders like spilled ink, staining the air, creeping across the polished floorboards toward her. His chest heaved. A low, wet growl rattled deep in his throat. The shadow wolf was tearing him apart from the inside. Sloane held her breath. Her poisoned blood hummed loudly in her ears. She watched the shadows whip around the room, extinguishing the flickering oil lamps one by one. The darkness swallowed the corners, leaving only the dying embers in the stone fireplace to illuminate his agony. He pushed off the door, taking a blind, staggering step toward the center of the room. "Get away from me," Vane rasped, his voice tearing at the edges. He gripped the edge of an oak dining table, his claws gouging deep trenches into the ancient wood. Sloane didn't move. Her analytical mind kicked into overdrive. He watched his chest hitch. He tracked the frantic twitch of his jaw muscles. He was in massive sensory overload. The slaughter in the courtyard, the fresh blood, the sheer volume of terrified heartbeats. It was flooding his brain. But as the creeping black mist touched the hem of her cold dress, it recoiled. Her toxic ash. Her artificial deadness. It was a sensory black hole. Vane's head snapped up. His eyes found her standing against the bookcase. He crossed the room like a strike of dark lightning, collapsing heavily into a leather chair just 3 feet from where she stood. He dragged his shaking hands through his dark hair, his breathing jagged. He was lethal. He could snap her neck with a flick of his wrist. But as he sat within her freezing, scentless aura, the violent shadows bleeding from his skin began to slow. The suffocating physical pressure in the room finally dialed back. She was his anchor. The silence stretched until the only sound was the crackle of the fire. He let out a long, shuddering breath. "Talk." His voice was a raw, desperate command. Sloane stared at his bowed head. "Talk to me," he whispered, his claws biting into the leather armrests. "Before I tear this room apart. Give me a sound to lock onto." Her throat felt like dry sandpaper. She swallowed hard, forcing her frozen vocal cords to work. "The load-bearing walls of this keep are 70 inches thick." Her voice sounded foreign in the massive room. Quiet. Flat. Steady. Vane didn't look up, but his shoulders twitched. He leaned slightly toward her, leaning into the sound. "They are constructed from volcanic granite," Sloane continued, keeping her cadence measured. "Mined from the northern ridges. The mortar is bound with crushed limestone and iron dust to disrupt terrestrial magnetic fields. It prevents thermal tracking." She fed him sterile logic, actively pushing the terror out of the room. "The floorboards beneath you are centuries-old heartwood, cured in salt water to resist fire. The catacombs below the stronghold. Why do you smell like a tomb?" The interruption was razor-sharp. Vane raised his head. The black mist had receded, pulling tight beneath his skin. His eyes were returning to amber, though the feral edge remained dangerously close to the surface. He stared at her, casually picking apart her composure. Sloane clamped her jaw shut. "Mountain ash," Vane stated, his eyes dropping to the faint discoloration around her lips. "Highly toxic. Destroys the liver. Erases the scent gland entirely. You've been microdosing it for years." He wasn't asking. He was diagnosing. Sloane crossed her arms tightly over her chest, burying her shaking fingers deep in the fabric of her sleeves. "I survived. You poisoned yourself to hide from a coward." "I survived." She repeated the words, her tone dropping to a hard freeze. "My biology is my own business. You asked for an anchor. You did not ask for a confession." Vane's eyes narrowed. The air between them crackled with sudden tension. He studied her quiet defiance. The fragile healer was openly denying the Shadow King. He didn't growl. He didn't demand obedience. A slow, dangerous smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. He simply accepted her boundary as reality. Then a horrific crash shattered the quiet. It came from the great hall directly beneath them. With splintering, the heavy, sickening thud of bodies hitting the stone floor. And a scream. A wet, gargling shriek that cut off abruptly into dead silence. Vane was out of the leather chair before the scream finished echoing. He threw the heavy oak doors open, the shattered deadbolt pinging against the stone doorframe. Her body moved on instinct, sprinting right behind him into the dark corridor. They tore down the stone hallway and burst onto the sweeping balcony overlooking the main hall. The smell hit her first. Fresh hot copper. Sloane gripped the cold iron railing, leaning over the edge to look into the expanse below. The massive hall was in chaos. The heavy iron grate leading down to the stronghold's underground prison system had been blown open. It lay twisted on the blood-slicked flagstones. At the edge of the dark, gaping hole in the floor lay a shadow guard. His throat was a ruined mess. The Obsidian Alpha was gone. He slipped the chains. One of Vane's lieutenants roared, stalking angrily around the dead guard. He was a wall of muscle, his face still painted with the blood of the courtyard slaughter. The coward used the drainage tunnels. He's in the catacombs. Cold dread plummeted through Sloane's stomach. The catacombs. Her old abuser wasn't locked away in chains. He was loose in the crushing dark beneath her feet, navigating the twisting tunnels he had controlled for decades. The temporary illusion of safety in the Alpha's quarters shattered like cheap glass. Hiding wouldn't save her anymore. Vane gripped the balcony railing, his knuckles turning stark white. The violent shadows began to bleed from his coat again. He had been challenged in his new territory within an hour of claiming it. "Seal the upper doors," Vane commanded, his voice echoing like thunder over the hall. "No one sleeps. We hunt him in the dark." Sloane stepped back from the railing, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. Down below, the massive feral lieutenant snapped his gaze upward. He ignored his Alpha's orders. His glowing eyes locked instantly onto Sloane. The look he gave her was pure hatred. He blamed her. She was the Obsidian ghost who had distracted their king and cost them a brother. She wasn't just hiding from the Obsidian Alpha anymore. She was locked in a fortress with feral lieutenants who wanted her dead, standing next to a volatile king who was barely holding on to his own sanity. The heat of the subterranean kitchens was suffocating. Sloane stood in the shadowed alcove near the hearth, her arms wrapped tightly around her ribs. Two shadow guards flanked the arched stone doorway, their glowing amber eyes tracking her every movement. She was allowed to fetch her own meager rations, but she was never unwatched. The air was thick with the scent of roasting venison, boiling root vegetables and pine smoke. But Sloane's nose was trained for the microscopic. She kept her gaze fixed on the rough stone floor. Across the bustling kitchen, near the iron butchering tables, stood the scarred lieutenant from the balcony. He was whispering to three other shadow wolves. Their heads were bowed close together. Their shoulders were rigid. Her body moved on instinct, shifting a fraction of an inch into the deeper shadows to observe them. The scarred lieutenant shifted his weight. The heavy heel of his leather boot scraped against the heated flagstones. Sloane stopped breathing. A sharp, incredibly bitter tang cut through the grease and pine smoke. It was a cold, metallic scent that burned the back of her throat. It was faint, almost masked by the roasting meat, but to a master healer, it was as loud as a siren. Atropa belladonna. Deadly nightshade. Sloane's eyes flicked down to the lieutenant's boots. A purplish-black paste was smeared into the treads of the leather, slowly cooking against the heat of the floorboards. He had just come from the northern greenhouse, the only place in the stronghold where the toxic plant grew. Nightshade didn't kill a werewolf. It paralyzed the nervous system, dropping their heart rate to a near-fatal crawl, rendering them helpless. The scarred lieutenant turned his head. He looked straight at the silver platter of raw, bloody steaks waiting to be carried up to the high table. He didn't look at the guard's food. He looked at the Alpha's portion. A cold, precise clarity wiped away Sloane's fear. The mutiny wasn't just a whisper in the dark. It was happening right now. They weren't trying to poison the Obsidian hostages. They were going to paralyze their own volatile king. The heavy oak doors of the Alpha's quarters slammed shut. Sloane didn't wait for the guards to lock the deadbolt. She dropped to her knees beside the mahogany bookcase and dragged her fingers frantically along the bottom edge. He found the loose floorboard. She pried it up, her raw fingertips bleeding against the wood, and pulled out a tightly wrapped leather roll. Her hidden cache. She spread the leather flat on the carpet. Vials of dried roots, crushed minerals, and highly concentrated extracts clinked softly together. She worked with terrifying speed. She selected a hollow glass dart, no longer than her index finger, and uncorked a vial of thick amber liquid. Aconite. Wolfsbane. But not enough to kill. Just enough to short-circuit the nervous system. Sloane carefully mixed the amber liquid with a drop of clear, distilled snake venom. The tactile sensation of the glass, the precise measurements, it grounded her. She wasn't an invisible, terrified hostage right now. She was a weaponized botanist. She could warn him. She could wait for Vane to return, tell him about the lieutenant, and let the Shadow King tear the mutineers apart. But Vane's Shadow Wolf was barely contained. If he knew his own elite guard was poisoning his meat, the betrayal would shatter his fragile grip on reality. He wouldn't just kill the lieutenant, he would slaughter the entire hull. She slid the finished dart into the hidden seam of her long gray sleeve. The cold glass pressed sharply against her pale wrist. She wasn't going to tell him. She was going to handle it herself. The realization hit her like a physical blow. For years she had relied on her toxic ash and absolute stillness to survive. Now she was actively preparing to step into the light. She was preparing to strike first. 3 long blasts of the stronghold horns echoed through the stone floorboards. The evening feast was beginning. The trap was set. The great hall was a deafening roar of overlapping conversations, clattering iron plates and heavy boots. Sloane sat rigid in the high-backed wooden chair to the right of the Alpha's seat. Vane sat beside her. He was leaning back, his dark coat unbuttoned, swirling a goblet of dark wine with a bored expression. But the shadows were still dancing across his knuckles. He was tightly wound, his eyes scanning the dark corners of the room for the missing Obsidian Alpha. He had no idea the real threat was walking straight toward him. Sloane tracked the movement through the crowd. The scarred lieutenant pushed through the throng of feasting wolves. He was carrying the ceremonial platter. The thick cuts of meat were piled high, dripping dark blood onto the polished silver. The staccato rhythm of his heavy boots against the stone floor seemed to sync perfectly with Sloane's erratic, poisoned heartbeat. He reached the high table. "Pie King," the lieutenant bowed his head, his voice a low rumble. He set the heavy silver platter down directly in front of Vane. The smell hit Sloane instantly. It was masked to a normal wolf beneath the overwhelming scent of fresh blood and raw marrow, but to her, the bitter tang of crushed nightshade practically screamed from the center cut of meat. It was soaked in it. The lieutenant stepped back, his glowing amber eyes dropping to the floor in a display of submission. "You hunt well," Vane murmured, his voice lazy and indifferent. Sloane felt the cold glass of the dart pressing against her wrist inside her sleeve. Her fingers twitched. Vane didn't even look down at the meat. He kept scanning the hall, tracking the exits. He reached his hand out, his long, calloused fingers closing around the handle of his hunting knife. He pulled the plate an inch closer. He raised the blade. Sloane stopped breathing. The entire room seemed to narrow down to the sharp edge of the steel and the poisoned meat waiting below it. Vane's heavy steel knife descended. Sloane slammed her hands flat onto the high table. She pushed backward. The iron-wrought legs of her wooden chair screeched against the stone floor. It was an ugly, ear-piercing scrape that cut through the low roar of the great hall like a physical blade. Vane froze. His knife hovered exactly 1 inch above the poisoned meat. He turned his head slowly, his amber eyes locking onto her. He didn't speak. He just waited. Sloane didn't look at him. She stepped away from the table. She abandoned the safety of his shadow and walked directly down the stone dais. The scarred lieutenant stood at the base of the steps. He watched her approach, a vicious sneer curling his upper lip. He didn't shift into a defensive stance. To a 250-pound feral werewolf, a pale, scentless healer was practically air. He puffed out his broad chest, intending to block her path. Sloane didn't stop. She walked right into his personal space. "Move, ghost," the lieutenant grumbled, his voice dripping with contempt. Sloane's hand shot out from beneath her long gray sleeve. She didn't punch. She didn't scratch. She simply pressed 2 fingers against the thick, pulsing vein on the side of his scarred neck. The cold glass of the hidden dart pierced his skin effortlessly. She depressed the plunger. The lieutenant gasped. His massive hands flew up to grab her throat, but the wolfsbane and snake venom hit his nervous system instantly. His knees buckled. The sneer slid off his face, replaced by blank paralysis. He crashed backward onto the stone floor with a massive, sickening thud. Sloane dropped gracefully to one knee beside his rigid body. She leaned in close enough for her lips to brush his ear. "Atropa belladonna," Sloane whispered, her voice a flat, clinical freeze. "Extracted too early. The roots are still alkaline. It would have only made him sick. If you want to drop a king, you have to let the leaves rot in the dark." He couldn't blink. He could only stare up at the vaulted stone ceiling in unadulterated terror. Only he and Vane were close enough to hear her quiet breakdown. The entire great hall realized what had just happened. Forks clattered onto iron plates. Conversations died. Hundreds of shadow wolves stared down at the tiny gray-clad healer kneeling over their most lethal lieutenant. Sloane stood up. She wiped her pale fingers on her skirt and finally turned back to look at Vane. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had just publicly assaulted his elite guard in front of his entire army. She had thrown away her invisibility. Vane stared down at her from the high table. The feral, dancing shadows that had been clinging to his coat all evening were gone. His amber eyes were wide, taking in the paralyzed lieutenant, the poisoned meat, and the fragile girl who had dismantled a monster without spilling a single drop of blood. He didn't yell. He didn't bare his teeth. Vane let out a low, rumbling laugh. It vibrated deep in his chest, entirely free of the shadow wolf's madness. It was a sound of profound respect. He stood up, kicking his own heavy chair back. He walked slowly down the stone steps, ignoring the paralyzed lieutenant at her feet. "Secure the meat," Vane commanded, his voice casually directed at the stunned room. "And arrest anyone who ate with him." He stopped directly in front of Sloane. He reached into his dark coat and pulled out a heavy roll of cracked leather. He pressed it gently into her pale hands. It was the master map of the stronghold's catacombs. "Lead the way, healer." The heavy iron grate slammed shut above them, cutting off the warmth and noise of the great hall. Darkness swallowed the stone stairwell. Sloane struck a long wooden match against the damp wall. The flame hissed loudly, casting wild, jumping shadows over the scarred faces of Vane's elite guard. She lit the pitch torch, her pale fingers gripping the rough wood so tightly her knuckles ached. "Stay exactly in my footprints," Sloane whispered. Her voice bounced sharply off the narrowing walls. "The floor gives way over the northern drainage pits." Vane didn't argue. He stepped down onto the slick flagstones directly behind her. The catacombs smelled like wet earth, rotting wood and ancient iron. Every breath Sloane took tasted sharply of copper and stale water. The rhythmic drip of condensation deep in the tunnels sounded like a ticking clock in the quiet. She navigated the twisting corridors by memory and the cracked leather map trembling in her left hand. He hated it down here. The freezing cold seeped directly into her bones, dragging up years of buried terror. This was where the Obsidian Alpha dragged his failures, a maze designed to break the mind before the body. "He went left," Vane murmured. His broad chest brushed lightly against her back as the tunnel narrowed. "I can smell the fear sweating through his coat." Sloane paused. She raised the torch higher. The flickering orange light illuminated a four-way intersection. The ceiling hung impossibly low, supported by thick pillars of volcanic rock. The shadows danced violently against the jagged walls. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply through her nose. She bypassed the stench of the Obsidian Alpha's panic. She ignored the stagnant water pooling around their boots. She searched the underground ecology. A cold spike of dread hit her stomach. It wasn't poison. It was dry, powdery, fractured load-bearing stone. "Wait," Sloane gasped, spinning around to face him. A loud, sickening crack echoed from the dark tunnel ahead. The Obsidian Alpha had tripped the ancient support beams. "Move!" Vane roared. The ceiling didn't just fall, it detonated. Sloane dropped the torch. Slabs of ancient granite rained down from the dark. The noise was concussive agony. It physically tore through her eardrums. She couldn't run. The floor buckled and gave way beneath her bare feet. An immovable weight slammed into her side. "Vane." He wrapped his arms around her fragile frame, twisting his body to shield her as they hit the ground. He dragged her into a narrow recessed alcove in the tunnel wall just as the main ceiling caved in. Boulders the size of carriages smashed into the floorboards where she had been standing a microsecond before. Dust exploded into the tiny space. It was thick, chalky, and suffocating. Sloane gagged, pressing her face hard against Vane's heavy coat, squeezing her eyes shut against the flying debris. The avalanche of rock felt like it lasted for hours. The earth screamed around them, grinding and settling with a terrifying, heavy finality. Then, dead silence. Total sensory deprivation. The torch was gone. The tunnel was gone. The elite guards were cut off on the other side of the collapse. Sloane opened her eyes to pitch-black nothingness. She was pinned tight against the freezing stone wall by Vane's massive body. The air in the tiny pocket was already growing hot and thin. She tried to shift, to push the heavy wool of his coat away just enough so she could breathe. Her hand slipped on something wet. Hot, thick liquid coated the sleeve of his coat. It smelled sharply of ozone and raw iron. He was bleeding. "Vane," Sloane whispered, her voice shaking in the dark. He didn't answer. A low, wet rattle vibrated deep in his chest. It wasn't a breath. It was a growl. The scent of his own blood in the enclosed space was toxic. It acted like a direct injection of adrenaline to his feral brain. The shadow wolf was taking over. The tiny alcove plummeted in temperature. Freezing shadows began to whip around the confined space. They lashed aggressively against Sloane's cheeks and arms like physical whips, unchecked by his failing consciousness. "Vane, listen to me," she said. She raised her shaking hands in the dark, blindly searching for his face. His hand suddenly clamped around both of her wrists. His grip was bone-crushing. He shoved her hands down, pinning them against the sharp stone. "Blood," Vane gasped. His voice was distorted, a terrifying dual tone echoing from his throat. "Too much. I can't. I can't." He was losing his mind. He was going to tear her apart simply because she was trapped in the dark with his monster. Her poisoned heartbeat skyrocketed. Panic screamed in her ears. She needed her toxic ash to shield her, but the suffocating proximity was overriding the deadening effect. She couldn't fight a 250-pound feral god. She had to anchor him. Sloane wrenched her right hand free with a desperate twist. She didn't push him away. She reached up and grabbed the back of his thick neck. She pulled his face down until his heavy stubble scraped against the soft skin of her throat. She pressed his open mouth directly against her wildly beating pulse. "I am right here," she commanded, her voice dropping into a hard freeze. "Listen to the rhythm. Focus on the poison. Do not lose to him." Vane shuddered violently. His sharp teeth scraped against her collarbone. The shadows whipped frantically in the tiny pocket of air, tearing at the fabric of her dress. But he didn't bite. He froze, his lungs heaving, his feral mind locking onto the erratic, poisoned thump of her heart. Thump, pause. Thump, thump. Slowly, agonizingly, his crushing grip on her other wrist loosened. He buried his face in her neck, breathing her in like oxygen. Before she could even exhale, a new sound echoed through the pitch-black stone. Flick, flick, flick. Metal hitting rock. Not far away. Sloane froze. Vane's head snapped up in the dark. The Obsidian Alpha's men were digging through the barricade. And they weren't trying to rescue them. Flick, flick, flick. The sound vibrated straight through Sloane's teeth. Heavy iron pickaxes biting into ancient stone. The Obsidian Alpha's men were digging through the rockfall to clear a path and finish the slaughter. Sloane pushed gently against Vane's chest. He released her immediately, his heavy breathing the only sound in the suffocating dark besides the relentless scraping. Her body moved on instinct. She dropped to her bruised knees, running her bare hands frantically over the freezing wet rock face of their tiny prison. Her fingertips caught on a thick residue clinging to the porous volcanic rock. She rubbed the damp powder between her thumb and index finger, bringing it to her nose. A sharp, bitter tang of garlic and raw metal cut through the heavy scent of Vane's blood. Phosphorus. The northern catacombs weren't just damp. They were coated in natural, highly volatile white phosphorus. Sloane began to scrape. She dug her broken fingernails directly into the freezing stone, clawing the chalky residue off the walls. She worked with a frantic rhythm. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The delicate scratching of her bleeding fingers completely opposed the heavy thud of the obsidian pickaxes outside the barricade. She reached into her hidden sleeve, pulling out a small leather pouch of crushed alkaline minerals. She poured the phosphorus directly into the pouch, her hands shaking as she mixed the lethal compound in the dark. "They think we are already dead," a muffled, cruel voice echoed through the thick stone. The obsidian ambushers were laughing. Sloane didn't flinch. He kept scraping. He packed the explosive powder tighter and tighter into the leather. She wasn't an invisible hostage waiting to be crushed in the dark. She was a weaponized botanist, and she was building a bomb out of the very walls of her prison. The stone barricade shifted. A heavy slab of granite slid backward with a sickening grind. A jagged hole broke straight through the center of the rockfall. Flickering, dirty orange torchlight violently pierced the absolute dark of the alcove. Sloane squeezed her eyes shut against the sudden brightness. Through the narrow gap in the rocks, an obsidian guard peered inside. His yellow eyes were wide, a vicious sneer twisting his scarred face as he searched the rubble for their crushed bodies. Sloane didn't freeze. She didn't shrink back into the shadows. She lunged forward. She shoved the tightly bound leather pouch of highly volatile powder directly into a deep structural crevice right beside the newly opened hole. She packed it down hard with her bruised thumbs, lodging it within the load-bearing cracks of the barricade. She turned her head, looking back over her shoulder. The dirty orange light caught Vane's face. He was covered in thick gray stone dust and his own dark blood. But the feral, chaotic shadows that had threatened to tear his mind apart moments ago were gone. His amber eyes were sharp, predatory, and lucid. He wasn't looking at the exit. He wasn't looking at the obsidian wolf mocking them through the gap. He was looking at her. He didn't order her to step aside. He didn't try to take over the violence. As the silence stretched over the crackle of the enemy's torch, Vane gave her a single nod. Sloane pulled a rough piece of iron flint from the deep pocket of her ruined skirt. He felt no fear. She felt only a cold, dark resolution settling heavily into her bones. She embraced her role as the destroyer of her abusers. She pressed the iron flint hard against the rough edge of the stone. Sloane struck the flint. A bright, hot spark jumped from the iron. It landed directly in the center of the crushed phosphorus. She threw herself backward, slamming her small body against the farthest wall of the alcove. Vane covered her instantly, his frame shielding her from the blast zone. The detonation was absolute. The audio dropped to a dead, ringing silence. The air pressure in the tiny pocket reversed, sucking the breath out of Sloane's lungs in a suffocating vacuum. A blinding, magnesium-white flash turned the pitch-black tunnel into midday sun for a fraction of a second. The heavy stone barricade didn't just crumble. It blew outward. Chunks of ancient granite and flaming debris were launched directly into the faces of the obsidian ambushers. The concussive shockwave violently threw the enemy wolves backward down the twisting corridor. Sloane's ears rang with a high, agonizing pitch. She opened her eyes. The choking smoke was already pouring through the massive crater where the barricade used to be. Through the thick gray haze, the obsidian ambushers were screaming. They were clutching their burning faces, rolling blindly on the wet flagstones, completely disoriented and stripped of their sight by the chemical flash. Vane moved. He didn't roar. He didn't monologue. He stepped out of the protective alcove and walked directly into the blinding smoke. The deafening ringing in Sloane's ears slowly began to fade. It was replaced instantly by the wet, concussive sounds of slaughter. She leaned against the cold stone, taking a shuddering breath of the chemical smoke, and listened to the Shadow King dismantle her nightmares in the dark. The chemical smoke hung in the air like a thick curtain. Sloane stepped through the jagged, smoking crater of the barricade. The broken pieces of ancient granite crunched loudly beneath her bare, bleeding feet, but she didn't feel the pain. The air in the corridor tasted sharply of burned phosphorus, ozone, and hot copper. She didn't close her eyes. She didn't hide in the shadows. She walked forward into the haze and watched Vane work. He moved with fluid efficiency. There were no grandiose roars. There were no monologues or performative displays of dominance. There was only the staccato, brutal rhythm of violence. A blinded obsidian guard lunged through the smoke. Vane stepped smoothly to the side, his massive hand snapping out to grip the guard's jaw. The guard dropped like a stone. Clean. Brutal. Fast. Sloane watched another ambusher scramble backward against the damp wall, weeping in terror. Vane didn't even break his stride. A blur of shadow, a flash of claws, and the weeping stopped instantly. For years, Sloane had trained herself to look away from the violence of the pack. She had erased herself to avoid the sight of blood on the stone. But as she watched Vane systematically clear the tunnel, a profound, dark peace settled over her racing heart. She wasn't terrified of his monster anymore. She accepted the violence entirely. It was the undeniable cost of her freedom. The narrow corridor widened, opening into the massive echoing expanse of the central underground cavern. The smoke began to clear, pulled upward by the ancient drainage vents. Hundreds of torches flickered around the perimeter of the space. Both packs had gathered here. The surviving Obsidian hostages stood trembling on the left. The lethal shadow wolves stood at attention on the right. They had breached the catacombs from the main grate, and now they stood in silence watching the tunnel exit. At the very center of the cavern mouth, backed against the jagged wall of volcanic rock, was the Obsidian Alpha. He was out of guards. He was out of traps. He pressed his back against the wet stone, his pristine leather coat torn and ruined, his eyes darting frantically toward the assembled crowd. Vane stepped out of the smoke and stalked directly toward him. "Wait," the Obsidian Alpha choked out, raising his shaking, bloody hands in front of his chest. His voice was stripped of its performative boom. It was a high, pathetic scrape. "Vane, we can negotiate the borders. I can offer you." Vane didn't slow down. "Pi King, please." The Alpha screamed, his gaze snapping wildly toward his own gathered pack. "Help me. I am your Alpha." No one moved. The Obsidian wolves kept their eyes locked on the wet stone floor. Sloane stepped out of the tunnel mouth, her pale dress stained with soot and blood. She stood in the very front of the crowd, refusing to lower her head. The Obsidian Alpha saw her. His yellow eyes widened in pure shock. The tiny, invisible ghost he had ordered to the execution block just hours ago was standing proudly in the light, watching his total destruction. Vane hit him. It wasn't a fight. It was an execution. In a brutal flash of dominance, Vane slammed the Obsidian Alpha back against the jagged rock. The impact shook the cavern walls. Vane's massive hand locked violently onto the Alpha's throat. He didn't ask for submission. He didn't ask for a final word. With one vicious, terrible pull, Vane tore the Obsidian Alpha's throat completely out. Blood sprayed in a heavy arc across the wet stone. The Alpha's body slumped forward, sliding down the cavern wall until it hit the floorboards with a sickening thud. Sloane didn't blink. She watched the light leave the eyes of the man who had tortured her for years. The suffocating weight of her past shattered into a million pieces. The brain demanded justice, and it was delivered in flawless silence. It was over. As the silence stretching so incredibly tight the entire cavern seemed to hold its breath, Vane slowly stood to his full height. He was drenched in the blood of his enemy. The dark, feral shadows whipped wildly around his broad shoulders. He turned away from the corpse. His glowing amber eyes swept over the massive crowd of terrified wolves, bypassing every single lethal soldier and groveling hostage, until they locked on Sloane. Vane walked directly toward her. The crowd of wolves instinctively parted, stumbling over themselves to clear a wide path for the feral king. The squelching sound of his boots against the blood-slicked stone was the only noise in the massive cavern. Sloane held her ground. She didn't shrink back. She met his glowing, predatory gaze with clarity. He stopped less than a foot away from her, towering over her fragile frame in the center of the carnage. He reached a blood-soaked hand into his dark coat. He pulled out the heavy, ancient silver crest of the Obsidian pack, the medallion he had ripped from the dead Alpha's chest. Vane opened his fist. The silver emblem hit the stone floor directly at Sloane's bare feet with a sharp, echoing clatter. He rejected the symbol of her abusers, casually discarding it in the dirt before her. "Hear me." Vane's voice rolled through the cavern like a crack of thunder. It wasn't a growl. It was a law. He didn't look at his army. He didn't look at the defeated pack. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the invisible girl who had dismantled his lieutenants and built a bomb with her bare hands. "This is your queen," Vane declared loudly, the raw power in his voice forcing the air out of the room. "She's my mate. My anchor. My equal. Any wolf who fails to meet her eyes loses their own. The payoff was complete. The massive, vindicating rush of power flooded the cavern. Her body moved on instinct. Sloane stepped out of the shadows. She reached up, her pale soot-stained hands coming to rest flat against the blood-soaked, heavily muscled chest of the broken king. The shadows clinging to his coat instantly settled. Around them, the sound of heavy bodies hitting the floor rippled through the cavern. One by one, then in sweeping waves, the combined wolves of the Shadow and Obsidian packs dropped to their knees in submission. They bowed to the lethal healer. Sloane stood in the center of her new kingdom, her head held high. And beneath her palm, pressing steadily against Vane's chest, her unpoisoned heart settled into a calm, fearless and steady rhythm.